who's logged into this webinar. I'd just like to start off today's session by just quickly acknowledging the rightful custodians of the land that I am personally meeting on, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I would just like to acknowledge the care and rightful custodianship that they have over the land, and I extend my respects to anyone who may be part of this group and any other Indigenous people across the world who may be watching. So I just wanted to quickly preface this with an introduction to what the BIPOC department is. We're the Black, Indigenous and Peoples of Colour department at the Australian National University, and we both advocate and support the people of colour on campus. This is a non-autonomous event, so there are people both from the BIPOC community and from the non-BIPOC community who are attending, and I'd just like to note that can everyone please be respectful of each other. I know that that's usually the status quo, but just flagging that we have lots of different attendees today. And I would just like to quickly address what Race 1001 is. So this is an initiative by the BIPOC department that we've been running this year, which involves extending our advocacy to departments within the ANU and academic institutions across Australia more broadly. The reason why we're doing this is because we perceive structural racism to be one of the biggest issues that students of colour are facing, and we think that by inviting and inciting discussions with people in academia and encouraging everyone to view the status of race and perceptions of race within academia, we might be able to have some more constructive outcomes and have students coming out of these academic institutions with a better perspective that's not so Eurocentric and is considerate of like the diversity that we have in Australia and more broadly. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jonathan to introduce our panelists today. Really looking forward to it, and yeah, enjoy everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Isabella, and thanks for everyone for logging in and joining the conversation today. So just real quickly, I'll also acknowledge traditional owners of the land. And so very much the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples here for the campus of the Australian National University. I remind everyone here within the ACT, but then also outside the ACT, and that includes the audience in the United States, for purposes of reconciliation, acknowledging the injustices of the past and those ongoing, to, if possible, check and see about the traditional owners of the land on which you reside, and understand and recognize the ongoing issues of sovereignty that exist there. So today the event is being co-hosted with the College of Law, so we thank BIPOC for the invitation. Just as a matter of positionality, I'm Jonathan Vildjeblad. I was born in a place called Taungji in Shan State, Myanmar. I found out rather recently in 2014 that I was part of an indigenous peoples called the Pa'o, and that information had been suppressed by my family for reasons that we're still trying to address. But this is the kind of story I think that indigenous peoples around the world are kind of experiencing. And so for many of us who grew up as youth, these are journeys that we're undertaking on our own, but also as part of a global movement. So I'm joined today by Mary Spears Williams, who's also at the College of Law, is also Sub-Dean of Indigenous Issues here at Australian National University. And she's having a conversation with Professor Jody Armour from University of Southern California College of Law. We invited Jody today to talk as an author and as a law professor, as a playwright, and also an activist on the topic of racism and criminal justice. As many of you are aware, the George Floyd incident within the United States sparked a mass uprising. And all of you have learned about the Black Lives Movement. What Americans probably don't know is that that movement had ramifications and echoes around the world, that similar protests occurred in other places, that paralleled a lot of the issues, the racial issues, the questions about injustice, discrimination, police brutality, structural racism. And in Australia, this was definitely an event that caught a lot of people's attention. And so the goal today is to is for audiences in Australia to gain an understanding of sort of the discourse that's playing out in the United States, and then conversely, for the audiences in the United States to gain an understanding of the discourses that are playing out in Australia, and hopefully that they can inform each other and provide some level of enlightenment about how we think through constructively the question about race and criminal justice, and racism and criminal justice. So we're going to begin with Jody having 20 minutes to talk about his approaches and his thoughts. A lot of it is arising from his book, the title of which you see in the background there. And I would encourage all of you to take a look at it. It is very profound reading. It's a reflection of interdisciplinary scholarship, which is a philosophical and academic approach that Jody and I share. We're part of the same school on that ground. And then, so Jody's going to talk for 20 minutes. He'll be followed by Mary, who will be talking for 20 minutes, hopefully to give her thoughts and commentary, and then to have a conversation directly with Jody so they can talk with each other. And after which I'll return as moderator to provide some connection to the students, to help students sort of think through these things about takeaways, calls to action, things for the next steps, and to then sort of help guide the kinds of questions that students can think about. And we invite students to provide questions within the Q&A box. You can type your questions in the Q&A, and I will bring those to the attention of Jody and Mary. And so at the very end, there'll be time. We're going for 90 minutes today. So at the very end, there'll be a lot of time for students to pose questions and for Jody and Mary to respond. So thank you. And everyone, please welcome Jody Armour. Thanks, Jody.
I'm looking forward to it since we talked about it and set the date. And in finding parallels between what we're dealing with here in the States with respect to social and racial justice, justice to socially marginalized groups, and what's going on in other parts of the world like Australia, I think there is a lot to learn from the American experience. When I was over in Poland at the behest of the State Department and the US Embassy over there, they wanted me to come over and open a library in Warsaw and then make a tour of major universities in Poland, talking about my then book, Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Cost of Being Black in America. And you might wonder, well, why would Polish folk want to talk to an American scholar about racial justice and his scholarship on it? You know, when I was in Poland, I saw virtually no Black folk or people of African descent at all in my 2.5 weeks over there. So you might wonder why. And the why was, of course, they said that when we read your book, some of the things you were talking about are all structured. They're the kinds of insights that apply not only to Black folk, for example, but to all socially stereotyped groups. Any member of a stereotyped group has a certain set of psychological processes that they can trigger, and I go into in my scholarship. So there are some rich parallels, and I'd be glad to talk some about those over the course of this 90 minutes. Let me start with this as kind of a way to get us into the conversation. Over here right now, there's a big debate. I guess FLAP, you know, might not be strong enough. You know, real controversy going on around teaching critical race theory in schools, in high schools, middle schools, grade schools, colleges, anywhere. Lawmakers have said there will be no critical race theory taught in these classrooms on pain of criminal penalty. They passed laws against it, right, in some jurisdictions. And you might wonder, what is critical race theory that it is so threatening that lawmakers are now out here prohibiting it and criminalizing it, or at least making it a ground for a dismissal from your employment. And let me tell you essentially what critical race theory is and how it connects to, I think, a lot of other experiences, including the experience of folks who are struggling for their rights and recognition in Australia. Derek Bell, former USC prof, who then migrated over to Harvard Law School and started teaching there, Black professor, looked around in the early 80s and mid 80s and said, you know what? We just had a civil rights movement in America. We went through the 50s and 60s and we won all of these court cases. We won Shelley v. Kramer, outlawing racially restrictive covenants. Brown versus Board of Education, separate but equal isn't going to work in school system. Loving versus Virginia, it's no longer constitutional to tell a Black man and a white woman or vice versa that you cannot marry someone from the other race, right? So we had all these court cases that got rid of formal discrimination. Then we had all of these laws that were enacted, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? The 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Civil Rights Act with respect to housing, zeroing in on housing, the 64 Act zeroing in on employment. Again, all of the formal barriers to equality, to racial equality, seem to be removed. And Derek Bell said, yet I look around me in the 80s, 20 years later, and I see still savage racial inequality. I see very little has changed in the 20 years since all of those monumental civil rights cases and laws and victories and triumphs. And he asked himself, how do you explain this? And we know, and he knew, that there were two explanations that presented themselves to people, to a lot of, political animals here and a lot of other folks. One was that, racial hierarchy, social inequality in America simply reflects biology. Black people are innately inferior. Therefore, you would expect there to be disparity in achievement because there's disparity in capacities and abilities going in, right? Very popular position. Charles Murray wrote a book, The Bell Curve, along with Richard Herrnstein, that became a bestseller in America, still sells a lot every year, that said that Black people are innately intellectually inferior to white people. That's what it said. And Asian folk, right? Today, still, you have an online, kind of publication like Quillette that has, at least at my last count, 4 or 5 skull measuring, kind of intelligence quacks, writing this sort of stuff. And the reason I call them quacks, just to be real clear going in about this explanation that finds the source of inequality in the deficiencies of the marginalized themselves, just so we can establish that that plain proposition has no empirical basis at all, so we can move on and call people who claim that kind of thing what they are, which is racist. So we can get to that point, I'd advise that anybody read a book by my favorite professor when I was an undergrad at Harvard, a paleontologist named Stephen Jay Gould. He wrote a great book called The Mismeasure of Man, in which he goes through and just completely debunks and obliterates all that skull measuring nonsense, right? Shows how the flimsy, shoddy, shaky science, so-called empirical scientific basis for it, that it does, it isn't worth a hill of beans. And so anybody who still subscribes to that philosophy in my book is very clearly no more rational and to be given no more respect than, I don't know, an anti-vaxxer, while we're in the middle of losing, hundreds of thousands of lives. I don't want to hear about any, anti-science stuff when we got so many lives at stake, and especially anti-science stuff that flies in the face of a mountain of empirical evidence. So anyone who continues to embrace the innate inferiority thesis is clearly, to my mind, a racist. You're saying that people are inferior on the basis of their race. That seems to me the definition of a racist. You're trying to give it some kind of rational grounds, but that's what you're saying at the end. Well, there aren't any rational grounds. Read Stephen Jay Gould, okay, to that. And then there are other arguments that people make or still try to locate the source of Black peoples and other marginalized groups, their lower status, locate the source of their lower status in their inferior selves somehow, in their inferior, maybe not their genes, but maybe their inferior culture. Maybe they have a culture of poverty. There's some other kind of cultural deficiency in these people that's making them less competitive. Or maybe there's some kind of psychological, it's not genetic, but psychological, problems that they're having, an enfeebled sense of self, an inability to defer gratification, some other kind of weakness in them, right? So that is one explanation. After you have the civil rights movement and continuing racial inequality, you can go to that set of explanations. Right? The alternative set of explanations is the one the critical race theory rather, came up with in the Legal Academy. It said, no, you can explain racial inequality in America without blaming the victims, without locating the source of it in any kind of inferiority of Black people. Its location may lie in systemic factors, structural factors, right? That's the alternative explanation. Now, let's go down that road and start to talk about how seemingly, for example, facially neutral laws can, as applied, give rise to discrimination, right? In practice, in operation, irrespective of the neutrality of their kind of facial formulation. So, to start to establish that sort of case and establish that truth, I and others, I was one of the early ones in the legal literature, the first to bring in at least social cognition work into criminal law analysis and say that there's a thing out here that we need to grapple with, and it's called the unconscious. And because of this thing called the unconscious, facially neutral rules can give rise to racially disparate applications. And what I mean by unconscious, I argued, was not the kind of Freudian model that Charles Lawrence had proposed before I started writing in his article, The Id, the Ego, and Equal Protection, Reckoning with Unconscious Racism. Arguments rooted in a Freudian framework are only going to convince people who buy Freud. If you don't buy Freud, you're not convinced. So I look to social cognition research, which takes an information processing approach to human cognition. You can replicate it in the laboratory over and over again and get robust, strong findings. And what I found was, in drawing on this research, is you can think about stereotypes and prejudice in importantly different entities. Stereotypes versus prejudice, right? What is prejudice? Prejudice is a belief, a consciously endorsed belief, that somebody is inferior because of their race, for example, or their gender, sexual orientation, what have you. I'm going to focus in on race right now, right? So prejudice would be a consciously held belief, Ku Klux Klan variety. Prejudice would be a conscious belief that another social group is inferior, innately. A stereotype, or inferior for some other reason. A stereotype, on the other hand, is not necessarily a conscious belief. A stereotype is a well-learned set of associations, right? That's all it is. Stereotypes is a well-learned set of associations. Like the 3-year-old little white girl who I described in one of my articles from a New York Times piece, who says to her mother upon seeing a Black infant, "Look, Mom, a baby made." Now that 3-year-old little girl, I wouldn't call her a racist. I wouldn't call her a bigot. She was simply reporting an association that had been forged in her memory between women from a certain social group and an occupation she sees them in repeatedly. She had a well-learned set of associations in that regard. She may get to reach the age of judgment, say 18, and come to renounce that as an appropriate way to think about Black women. In other words, her conscious beliefs for how she ought to respond to the world and others may be egalitarian and racially liberal, right? She would not be prejudiced, in other words, but she still has that well-learned association, that well-learned set of associations, right? Established in her memory from a very early age. And here's the thing about well-learned associations. They can run automatically without our conscious awareness. That's how they work, right? Think about learning to drive. When you first get behind the wheel, every maneuver takes intention, attention, and effort, right? Turning the wheel, hitting the gas, hitting the brakes, trying to coordinate all of that. It's just, takes a lot of intention, attention, and effort. And if you throw in a manual, a stick, now you got a clutch and a stick. When I taught my own 3 sons to ride sticks, I rented cars. I got rental cars because I knew there was going to be a learning curve. There were going to be some ups and downs as they figured out how to coordinate those movements. But you also know from driving that when you repeat those associations, those maneuvers enough, you don't have to think about them anymore. They become automatic. You can drive down the street. I drive down the street now with my sons. They were driving with a stick, and we're debating about healthcare reform. There have been times I've left my garage and pulled into work about 20 minutes from here, and I couldn't even tell you how I got there because I was on automatic pilot, right? Those well-learned set of associations were running automatically. And that frees your conscious mind. William James talks about this for survival stuff. There are evolutionary reasons for this. But what that means is that we have mental habits, well-learned sets of associations or mental habits that we form that can run automatically without our conscious awareness. Those are stereotypes. All stereotypes are that way. They may be at odds with our personal standards for how we ought to behave, right? So you can have a stereotype but not be prejudiced. That's why I avoid the claim that some people make, like Ibram Kendi, in his anti-racism work, that we're all racist. No, we're not all racist. We're not all prejudiced. There are a good number of people, fortunately, who hold personal standards that are egalitarian and racially liberal, right? We are all creatures of habit, yes. We do all have unconscious mental reflexes that we develop over our lives through being socialized and exposed to the environments that we are. So all of that's real, but we need to distinguish between stereotypes and prejudice. And once we do, we see that stereotypes, these unconscious mental processes, can actually drive our legal and social decision-making without our conscious awareness. And I'll give you one. There are lots of examples. They've done all these studies, for example. There's so many. I'll give you one real quick one. I was a horn player, trumpet player, in my earlier life for a long time. And so I love keeping up with musical things. And I ran across this study in which people had to do recitals for judges on the violin. And the judges were going to determine whether they were first chair material or not. Had to rank them, evaluate them. And the judges were male and female. And they saw the performers perform. They were all performers were professionals, been doing this a while. They saw the performers perform, and good number of performers were male, good number of performers were female. And the judges only determined that about 5% of the female performers were first chair material. Then they put up a screen and had the performers perform behind the screen so the judges couldn't see them, had to go just by their ear. Suddenly, the percentage of women who were deemed first chair material went up about 20%. Went up to 20%, way more than 20%, went up to 20%, right? And another study went up to 30%. So that's a big gap. And it suggests that when you see, and these are old social psychology studies, when you see, they used to do this with books. If they put a woman's name on a book cover as the author, it's evaluated more negatively than if they put a man's name on the same book. And it happens with respect to male and female evaluators, suggesting that we all learn these social stereotypes, internalize them, and they can drive our perceptions and judgment without our conscious awareness. Right, and we see this all over the place. One of the places that I find it kind of most, in my most recent book, N Asterisk GGA Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law. One of the places I found this unconscious phenomenon most kind of chilling and disturbing is a set of studies that I talk about that have to do with brain imaging technology. When I first started studying the cognitive unconscious, they weren't using brain imaging technology as part of a lot of these studies, hardly any of them. Just didn't see it. We had to make a lot more inferences, we could on the basis of reaction times and all that sort of thing. But for this latest book, I ran into all this brain imaging technology. They can put on the fMRIs, et cetera, and we can say, here's your brain, and here's your brain on race, right? We can see what's happening in your brain as you're processing information about race. And what they found is, what was really sobering for me was that if somebody is looking at somebody else, let's say you have a white person looking at another white person who's drinking a cup of water. The observer simulates what they see in their own brains. In other words, their mirror neurons start to fire. They don't actually lift their own arm up and sip water. They don't actually do it physically, but in their brains, the mirror neurons simulate what they see. They take them through those motions, right? These mirror neuron firings, they're the basic building blocks of sympathy and empathy, in other words. The basic building blocks. What they find in these studies, we got in the imaging, here we go, is if you're a white person, though, looking at a black person drink a cup of water, the mirror neurons aren't firing. The mirror neurons don't fire. The basic building blocks of empathy and sympathy aren't firing, right? And that explains a lot, right? When you think about how much discrimination there is in America toward Black folk and how so often it seems like there's an indifference to the plight of Black people, it starts to explain a lot. I'm thinking about Hurricane Katrina hitting New Orleans back in 2006 and flooding everything. If you look at some pictures from back then, you'll see you had all these Black people standing on rooftops with water, literally, not figuratively, literally up to their necks. Yeah, helicopters, you know, with the pictures. One day goes by. I'm gonna wrap this up then. One day goes by. 2 days go by, no relief. 3 days go by, no relief. 4 days go by. I remember turning on the TV, seeing Sean Penn rowing up there, the actor, handing out fresh water because FEMA still hadn't gotten its act together to go and do something about those Black lives in distress. There was not a panic of empathy for those Black lives. On the other hand, when those planes ran into those buildings in New York, nobody wanted to hear anything about any bureaucratic impediments or any red tape. They just had a panic of empathy for the victims and got it done. You know, like you would if you saw a family member in a house burning, a burning house, you'd have a panic of empathy and you get something done, right? So this phenomenon, they call it in-group empathy bias, out-group, you know, empathy deficit, explains a lot about how unconsciously, when it comes to making social decisions about out-group members from socially marginalized groups, we may lowball the value of their interests quite unintentionally, quite unconsciously, but still, that's one of the ways that systemic racism or structural racism can perpetuate the kind of discrimination we're talking about. But now I'll be glad to start to take questions. Let's mix it up a little bit with that.
Thanks for that, Jody. Mary, I'm turning to you now. So this is, and you and Jody, you can raise your comments and thoughts. And Jody, you're welcome to have questions and comments for Mary as well. So thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Jody. Weta, I'm in Alice Springs. I'm in Mwanpa in Central Australia. And I just want to I just want to acknowledge that I'm on country and that we're all on country, those of us who are in the place that's called Australia, and to acknowledge the custodianship of this place, this extraordinary place, the care that has been taken of it. And specifically, I need to acknowledge the Ngunnawal Ngambri people where the ANU's main campus is located, and also that of my ancestors who are from Darkinjung country. Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan, for asking me to join. And Isabel, yeah, dog alarm. Don't know if you can hear that. Might happen a few times. Yeah, Isabel, I'm really glad that we got to have this conversation. We've been bouncing around with BIPOC a little while now about doing an event, and awesome. The more we can talk together, the better. And I can't wait till we can actually be in a room together again, right? This is killing us. I just found out that I can't go to Darwin. Like, I'm getting all these messages from friends because I'm supposed to be on a plane to Darwin later on today. Just gone into lockdown. Anyway, yeah. So Jody, my friend, I wanted to. Wow, your book is really on fire, right? It's there's so many topics that you talk about, and it's so stimulating and provocative from my point of view as an Australian, as a woman in Australia who's descended from First Peoples, but also from coloniser settlers, some of whom were pretty egregious. So I've got all of that flowing through my being. I carry the past from the First Fleet of Anglo convicts that came out here. And and just this idea, I want to sort of, and I'm always fascinated because I've been quite, you know, as a young Aboriginal woman, our family was really captured by a lot of the Black Power movements in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up, really caught up in a lot of the protest movements. The theory, Black Power, had a big influence over here. It really captured, you know, that the vibe and the change that was going on in the early 70s anyway, but also we just had a big surge of support of anti-racism in Australia, which is expressed through a very limp constitutional reform that we had in 1967, where, you know, they finally agreed to count us in a census, basically. It was, I mean, there's this real myth that that's when Aboriginal people were recognised, and but it's just complete garbage what that constitutional reform was. It was really pathetic. But nevertheless, there was this amazing sentiment around that, and it took decades of getting past a white Australia policy in the mid-20th century. And the thing is that it had a really big influence. So people like Bobby Sykes, who's African-American, she was at Harvard, she came over to Australia. She's friends of our family and so on, involved with the Redfern Activists, which is a suburb in Sydney, which is like a kind of ghetto for a long time of Aboriginal people who, like a diaspora of Aboriginal peoples from across the Sydney Sandstone Basin especially, but people who come in from Western New South Wales and other parts of Australia. That was where you went to Redfern. And so that had a really big influence in consciousness raising and so on, but also really trying to think about who we are and our identity. And then through the development of things like lands councils, the recognition of what's called land rights, which is now called native title and so on, in Aboriginal organisations, I'm saying that deliberately, when I say Aboriginal, I mean the First Peoples across the continent. We've got, there's 250 languages spoken in Australia. There's up to 900 language ecologies. We're as different as the places of our continent. And Australia is vast, it's vast like America is vast, right? So, and we are of our country. So we are as different as our country, but we're also really strongly connected through trading routes and songlines and international relations that have gone on for millennia and millennia. Like, it's really hard to get a grasp of the antiquity of our culture. Like, they say that we're the oldest continuing cultures on the planet. And, and it's just really, it's sort of, every now and then when you go overseas, it sort of rocks you because you're in Europe or, the United States, and there's some beautiful ancient thing that you're looking at, and then you discover it's a church that's 800 years old, and you're like, what? Like, I've actually got a cave up where we live, which is about 5,000 years old, and it's just like, that's really unremarkable in Australia, right? So, so us trying to come to terms, what I'm trying to get to is this your opening in the book where you talk about identity, and you're really poking, like it's a real, you can tell it's a real pain point in the US, this N word, which I'm sorry, I don't know about the, I watched The Good Fight, an episode of The Good Fight, which is all around the N word the other night. And I know that it's sensitive, but I haven't spent enough time in the US. So I really hope I don't say anything offensive. I don't mean to, and I would really like to be corrected if I have said something here. But, I remember that word being used when I was a kid, but for us, that word is probably abo, right? Or coon. There's a whole lot of, pejorative epithets which are used to describe us and ways to sort of, strike us down, to put us in our place, to make us feel like we're somehow putrid or, or trampleable. We ought to be underfoot. So let's use these terms. And so I get what you're trying to do. Like, its terminology is really disruptive, right? And I was just reflecting on the way that we use it here and the way that we deploy it to think about our identity. So, so in Australia, for example, we go through these different stages where we went from, we rejected the idea of native for a while, because that's the term that was being used around the time that the Constitution was drafted in Australia in 1901. And the Australian Constitution is a highly racialised document. It's the only races that are mentioned are, the races that are mentioned, you'll see in a moment, I'm going to talk to you about how I quibble with the idea about race. But Aboriginal peoples are mentioned as natives, and then there's also other races, which are basically, but there's no mention, like the actual race or the identity of the Anglo-Saxon colonizer settlers, the inheritors, the colonisers themselves, who basically use that instrument to transfer all the colonial resources and the power to extract from the British to Australia. That's what the Constitution was in Australia. So in that sense, it's highly racialised, because nothing at all changed from Indigenous people's point of view, from Chinese immigrants' point of view, for example, from Malaysian, Afghani people's point of view, who are like people who've been living with us for centuries, right? Afghanis go back hundreds of years. Our relationships with people from Malacca up on the Indonesian archipelago, really strong connections up there. All of the islander peoples, we've had really strong relationships. They were basically like, no, you don't count, even though much stronger connections to country and to us than those. So we pushed back against native as being a pejorative, rejected terminology around abo and coon. And of course, Australia was trying to position itself as this fabulously human rights, nice place. Like New Zealand does this too, by the way. We're really nice places, right? We're the backpackers you like meeting when you go overseas, when you bump into each other in Bangkok or whatever, right? And you all get together, all the Canadians and the Americans and the Australians, and talk about whatever TV shows you saw or whatever, you know, the whole Kansas thing. It's all like, we're all so nice, we all get on right. Anyway, so yeah, so we've got this nice thing going on. And part of that comes from, like, Australians were actually instrumental. It was an Australian who actually drafted the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Like, the first draft was an Australian who did that in the 50s, when we were right in the absolute zenith of the White Australia policy. I mean, there's just no, like, complete lack of irony about that. There's also, we've got these layering of veils and like ways that we sort of push and deny and forget the reality, and we sort of smooth things over, all about constantly making ourselves comfortable. And I'm putting myself, the hour that I'm using now is like the colonizer settler, us, you know. And so Australia, we don't have, we of course we've got some people who are really grossly racist in the way that we observe quite often coming out of the United States. As I say, I'm getting this, I've only visited the United States for a very short time, so you're routinely stunned by the strength and the violence of the racist terms that are thrown around. I mean, it's just this sense of entitlement to say this stuff is astounding. Now, in Australia, we have racism big time, right? But the thing is, it's really sort of influenced really strongly by this Anglo culture, I suspect, which, like, you have to be nice all the time, right? So you sort of, you push it down, right? And so that's one of the things. So somebody like me, you know, when we get into the whole politics of appearance, right, which you also get into a bit in your book too, like, I sort of carry this really uncomfortable passport around with me, which is my appearance, right? So it means that quite routinely, people will draw me into a conversation, an us conversation, where we talk about them. And I'm kind of like, oh, what am I, this is like, and where's this going? And then sure enough, it comes out that, you know, the tail comes out, you know, the horns show, the fangs, you know, and I'm like, whoa, you know, like, what's going on about that? And so you're kind of made complicit about this racism, and it's quite, it's really unfortunate, you know, like, I'm all for Aboriginal rights, but, you know, the violence, you know, it's just, you know, while they drink their Chardonnay or whatever. And it's just really kind of, yeah, there's this kind of thing where you're like, and you're simultaneously, you know, routinely my identity is erased. It's whitewashed. Like, I don't get to be Indigenous because of the way that I look, because of the way that racialisation has operated in this country, and the assumptions that are made about who you are, and also the fact that I'm successful, I've got, you know, I'm comfortable financially, you know, my family have got, you know, issues like everybody's family has, and we have had probably, you know, you know, we're sort of talking first in family and my parents when they went to uni, but it's sort of, nevertheless, they have got lots of issues, but it doesn't compare, for example, to the people who get captured by the criminal justice system, because for whatever twists and turns of fate that happened, and this isn't a whatever, this is actually systemic, this is what I'm going to get to, and I want to tackle your notion of luck that you talk about in your book, right? This isn't luck that we've ended up this way. There were deliberate decisions made in my family to save, like, you know, my youngest great uncle is actually my second cousin, right? So he was actually, they became white and they moved away from the Hawkesbury River to save Billy, because as you know, the son of the eldest, you know, my great aunt, he was the son of my great aunt, right, by another Aboriginal man who was she could pass as not an Aboriginal, but her partner was Aboriginal, and so Billy looked Aboriginal. So but he had to be adopted into our family, and then they had to pretend that he was actually the ninth son. And they moved away from the river, away from community, stopped being Aboriginal to save Billy. Like, so there's all sorts of really, and they're aware of that, because, you know, we're right in they've been, you know, colonizer settlers have been taking Aboriginal kids since they got here, basically, various ways, either taking our lives directly or, like, literally burying us in the sand and then knocking our heads off, or alternatively just taking us as you know, curiosities, or to raise us up as maids and, you know, station hands or whatever it is. But also now we've got this really ornate and elaborate structure of child removal, where we've never had more Aboriginal children taken away from families than we ever have before. So, so the thing is that when we come and talk about, like, the terms that you're using here, like, we are regularly, like, routinely shifting the ground around that. So we've gone from saying, we're not Aboriginal, we're Indigenous, because don't you understand? We're trying to tell you there's political ends to us describing ourselves as a whole, pan-Aboriginal groups. Like we come up with these terms to describe our, hundreds of, tribal groups that we've got around Australia. And so we'll come up with the term, we'll say, oh, we're Indigenous. And then we're still finding that there's this resilience to that, and we're still being racialised in that. So then we go, okay, look, we don't like being called Indigenous anymore. We want you to call us Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So we get more specific, because the Islander peoples are actually probably arguably, they're kind of like connected as much to the Pacifica peoples as they are to us, and also up to New Guinea and that, right? So, but they're much more distinct than Aboriginal peoples, because we've got all of our song lines and so on going across the continent. And so, yeah, and now we're actually really pushing back and insisting, then there's a big push that we all be named for our language groups to get that specificity. And that's kind of freaking everybody out, because it's like, what? There's a lot. Like we just went from Aboriginal, and now we've got 300 plus terms we've got to learn. And so it's part of this sort of disruption. But now what we're trying to do, look, some of us, not all of us, because the problem is that this is what happens with racialisation, is that so many of us have lost our own identity. They turn us into a race, and they manage to let us forget who we really are, which is part of country, and thereby achieve dispossession. Right, this is actually my father's observation about it. It's taken decades for me to kind of get where he's coming from, but I'm now just going, oh, mate, I now get it. So many of us are now recognising that language, like dark and young, is the language that was given to us. Like we're from the Sydney Sandstone Basin, so it's hard to know really what's going on, because our language, there's a massive rupture in our language because of the slaughtering and the removals of people in that place. But there's other places where, language is named for the place, and the word comes from the place. Country taught us our language. And so more and more we're naming ourselves for our places to try and bring home the fact that we are actually of country. So the reason why I'm talking about this is because it really goes to this idea about identity, and I'm always made so, I also find myself uncomfortable in a good way, like a provocative way, and I don't push back from being made uncomfortable. I think it's really healthy to be uncomfortable. I love it. And so when I meet with friends from North America who are Aboriginal or Native American, Canadian area, US area, I'm always troubled, for example, around notions around blood quantum and descendancy is somehow defining, and the way the state has such a stake in saying who you are, which we're just like, no way, you don't get to do that over here. Because in our we know that there's the so-called protection era, when they were removing kids, they were literally deliberately trying to breed out the Aborigine. They actually had these tables of cattle, like it's like breeding cattle or something, like actually counting octoroon, quadroon, etc., because there is this belief that we were going to die out. And because we have, we arguably have been subject to the worst racism, because we were the missing link. We were, they didn't manage to pull that. Eventually, those sorts of ideas didn't stick with African Americans and African peoples, and because the incredible strength and resilience has been shown through their cultures and societies and so on. But with Aboriginal peoples in Australia, they are managing to do it because we tended to go paler more quickly. So this idea that we were going to disappear. So, and I bought into that for a while. Like I actually found an essay from when I was at law school that said, it's like early days of writing position statements where I said, I'm actually an example of how effective assimilation is. I'm assimilated. I'm descended from Anglo, blah, 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 but I can't say that I'm Aboriginal because I'm assimilated. And I'm going, what the hell was I doing? Now I'm like, you let them win. You let the stolen generations win if you agree to that. You've got to own who you are and the influences that are there. And of course, my father's always been Aboriginal, like that's who he is. So there's all these sort of confusing ideas about race that inform that, and race is so connected to the idea of appearance as well. And so, but having said that, it's really important we can't pretend that there's not a difference. Like it's still something that people live. If you're a person of colour, your life experience is radically different from mine. I might be uncomfortable because somebody has a go at me for having a position of a subdean of Indigenous Studies when I'm not Aboriginal. That literally has happened to me a couple of times, by the way. But it's by people who work in Indigenous Studies, which is like, oh my God, this is really troubling. But anyway, but the thing is that this is still something we really have to grapple with, and to really, you know, we've got this idea about race is not a thing, and so we will say something like, you know, we say that this is not acceptable. It's myth-making, because it's basically like it's a box that you can be put in. Like if we can be called an abo, and then all these stereotype epithets can be taught about that, like you were just talking about before, Jody. You know, for example, with your wee lass who's being taught that, oh, this is what a baby maid looks like. We can be taught these stereotypes. So like race is like a box that somebody else gets to colour in and describe the, you know, the typology. Whereas that's not what we are. We're not raced. But on the other hand, the lived experience of race is a real thing that we've got to grapple with. So I guess I just want to go into that. Like, it's a massively difficult thing. I'm still working out. I spent decades thinking about it. Thanks. My dogs have really strong feelings about it as well. Anyway, let's go there. Can we do that, Jody?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. I'm going to mute myself.
Let's dive in right there, because I think that's one of the questions that is often asked. You know, what is a Black person? What makes you Black? Who's Black? Right? It's a common question that arises in group after group. What groups aren't grappling with those kinds of questions? Who belongs? Who's a member? Who's a member of our group? What are the contours of the boundary of the group? Right? And are those contours imposed externally from without, or created internally from within? Right? Those are universal questions. All over the globe, we're grappling with those kinds of questions. Different groups are grappling with those kinds of questions. So I can talk about it in terms of the Black experience here in America, and then I think there are lots of things that are generalizable, while there are also things that are just specific and particular and, you know, and unique. I understand that as well. But one of the things I told the folks over in Poland when I was taking a tour of universities over there and talking about racial and social justice over here, I said, you know, I noticed you have a lot of cultural imports from America here as I've been traveling around the country. You know, when I go into any of the clubs, I'm hearing hip hop everywhere. I might as well be on Sunset Strip. You know, Black music is over here, you know, just, you know, all over the club scene and the music scene. Then when I'm down in Krakow, I see, you know, all these joints have jazz, you know, with people, you know, but big 18-foot bust of Louis Armstrong, you know, more Black art, more, you know, Black genius, you know, despite all of the racism, more Black genius expressing itself on a global stage. But I said, you know, one American cultural import you should be wary of, or at least very clear about, is what we do with and what we call over in America race. Because this is how we do race in America. White woman, white man, white baby, Black woman, Black man, Black baby, white woman, Black man, Black baby. Black woman, white man, Black baby. Now let's say you take that baby from that Black man and white woman, and that baby has a baby with a baby from two white people, a white baby, quote unquote, right? What baby comes out from that union? A Black baby. A Black baby. Now you take that baby and you have that baby marry or have a kid with a white person. What comes out? A Black baby. That's how we do race in America. That's how we've always done race in America, right? And the reason we've done race in America that way is because what defined Blackness, what made you Black, never had anything to do with biology. I just made that point. That makes it, how much clearer can you make it than that? You can have a quadroon, octoroon, far more white genes or blood in them than Black, but they're still Black. Because it's not about biology. You are confused. You're caught up in a category mistake if you're thinking about biology when it comes to race in America and black and white folks. All right, it's always been, blackness has always been defined by one criterion and one criterion alone. And that's that auction block. If you could stand on that auction block, that made you black. If you could be sold as chattel and your kids ripped out of your arms and sold as more chattel, that's what made you black. Didn't have anything, it didn't have to do with biology. And that was understood. And so going in, you know, black folk in America have always recognized that there's contingency even in the definition of blackness and how we are defining our groupness. We understand that from day one. Many, not everybody, but you know, a lot of people do. See it in a lot of our literature, a lot of music, a lot of movies, etc. A recognition of that nuance. The recognition that at the same time, race is completely contingent and socially constructed, it also has real life consequences. It also has real life meaning. And in fact, black folk have defined race as much as been defined by outsiders in terms of race. Black folk, after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished, had to then decide who's black, okay? Not just be told who's black, but now we have to decide who's black internally among ourselves, because we have people in our midst who can pass, who can walk around, walk through white society and look like Robert Redford. You wouldn't know the difference. Right? Are they black? We had to make that decision. The society didn't have to decide because they could pass. They could go incognito, as they said back in those days. Right? So we had to make decisions about, you know, we could have said, oh, we're going to distinguish between light-skinned blacks and dark-skinned blacks, like some countries do. We're going to distinguish between this kind of black and that kind of black. We could have done that as a group. But we didn't. We said no. In our music, in our art, in our symbolic communication, we said no. Black is beautiful. The Harlem Arts Renaissance in the 1920s and 30s, you know, you had a lot of black folk defining blackness and making sure that we all saw that blackness includes every hue, light, dark, and everything in between. Right, that's been part of a hard fought, when, you know, and then you got to the 60s and the Black is Beautiful movement. Black is beautiful, not along with Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, and Black Power was Black is Beautiful. And by Black is Beautiful, we mean not only Black is beautiful if you look white, if you're black and you happen to look white, but Black is beautiful when you don't look white, especially when you don't look white. Right? Because I recognize anyway, that there is a lot of privilege, colorism within the black community. A light person like me doesn't have nearly the same kind of impediments thrown in front of him as a darker skinned black person. Right? A darker skinned black man is looked at more threatening. It's shown in psychological studies at an unconscious level and on a conscious level. Light-skinned women are all you see in the mass media when it comes to black women in the mass media. Just about all you see. All kinds of stories about how much intra-racial colorism we have to contend with because, you know, the somatic norm image of America has been defined around a European standard of beauty. All right, and the more you approximate that European standard of beauty, the more beautiful you're deemed. And once you start to see that beauty standards themselves are political, not given, but political, right? That a society's somatic norm image. That's what sociologists call it, the somatic norm image. The standard of appearance that's considered most attractive or high, kind of the highest, that somatic norm image is a cultural property. That's a property of groups. Groups vie over that. And groups dominate other groups in the society by making them conform to their somatic norm image or to appreciate their somatic norm image as higher, as superior. I remember some of my roommates, one of my upper class roommates said in his freshman year at Harvard, he had 3 guys living with him. They decided they were going to put posters up on the wall. He wanted he was living with 3 white guys. He was the only black guy. He wanted to put up a picture of a black woman. The white guys wanted to put up pictures of, some white models. They didn't have enough room for all the posters. So they said, well, take down the pictures of black models because the white models are the universal standard of beauty. Right? The white models are universally recognized as beautiful. Whereas, that what you're talking about there, that's more of a niche aesthetic framework. So yeah, I feel you on all that you're saying. I'm going to let you start, let's get the conversation going. But we've been grappling with that a lot over here within the Black community, both along, both in terms of how you look, your class. I can talk a lot about, the Black bourgeoisie versus truly disadvantaged Blacks and how often the Black bourgeoisie turns its back on truly disadvantaged Blacks for class reasons and how that's resisted. Yeah. So yeah, anywhere you want to go, Mary, I love your opening. I'm ready to run with you.
So one of the things, for us, like who are from here, our way of pushing back against racism is not to sort of say to turn race into a good thing, but to reject the idea of race. And to say, well, we're not a race, we're of country, we're Indigenous, we're Aboriginal, we're from the first people, we're here, that's who we are, just no. So, and the thing is that it makes racism much more clearly makes sense to us as a phenomenon, as a product of colonisation, and not just to this country, but as part of a global trend. And I know that and I think this is the thing about our countries. They were both colonised by the same United Kingdom, or whatever. I was going to say something bad, but anyway, being recorded. So there's why I'm just perplexed that colonisation isn't a way to help to kind of untangle this mess, because even if one steps into an anti-racist, like a racism as a negative thing, but we still are holding on to the idea of being a race. How can we do that? How can we get past racism if we're still holding on to the idea of being a race, if our identity is still as a raced person? This is not a rhetorical question. I'm actually genuinely asking that because how do we push back completely against all of this? Because for me, I do look at everything in terms of critical Indigenous perspectives. Like I look at what's framed and what we include in the consideration, and I don't see enough of those broader historical phenomenon of colonisation, the way it's affected the United States. When I read about, there's so many amazing ways that critical race scholars, starting from Derek Bell, moving on. Honestly, we were reading Miss Measure of Man at the same time. Like that, what an amazing book. I know, Stephen Jay Gould's not African American, but is he? He's not African American, is he?
No, Stephen Jay Gould, no.
Yeah. So, I've just got so many of his books. It's incredible. But that blew my mind, right? Like that was like my first or second year at university, I think, when I read his stuff. And then hitting Derek Bell, and then hitting Kimberly Crenshaw, and and then you start getting into the Mari Matsudas and all of these other incredible people who are just really disrupting all of these ideas around identity. But I'm still sort of left with there's this larger structure and phenomenon. For me, I know it's not the answer for everything, but the way that colonisation intersects with capital, and capital is a major story as part, the labour flow, you mentioned about chattel slavery, right? Like that's the whole world economics can actually be argued, around chattel slavery, like a foundation of the world's economies. Like some people have argued, some post-colonial scholars like Kwame Namake and so on over in, you know, he's over in the Netherlands now. But yeah, so it's, anyway, so just, that's my last question before I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan, because I know that there's some questions coming in. But does colonisation shed any other light or help you to make sense of identity and identity politics and the way that racism continues to just cycle around?
Oh, absolutely. You know, you have to read Frantz Fanon to understand what's going on in America. And he was talking about the colonial experience, right? And he shed a whole lot of light. I mean, he's required reading, I think, if you're trying to understand the Black American experience, you know, or any experience, internationally, of the diaspora for that matter. But so, yeah, there are powerful analogs in colonial studies, you know, very powerful ones. I can go over to someplace, for example, Nigeria.
Yep.
A number of colonized countries in Africa. And I can see the same phenomena that I just described to you that's happening in Black America happening over there. So for example, one of the things that comes out of that struggle over the somatic norm image and the politics of beauty is how you think about your hair and skin as a Black person, especially as a dark-skinned Black person with kinky hair, like all my sons have, much more so than I. And do you want to denature your hair? And do you feel that its nappiness and kinkiness is a disaesthetic, ugly, as many folks have thought for many generations who are Black in America? Because it's not like white hair. So we've done things like, you know, hot combs and lyes and chemicals to relax it so that we can more approximate the European standard of beauty and appearance. Do we put on skin bleaches to lighten our skin, right? Well, we've been grappling with that here in the United States since I can't, as far back as I can go. It's in the Black community. But you know what? You know who the two biggest markets for skin bleaches are? Not America, India and Nigeria. Okay, colonization can work very similarly, you know, in very different settings. You know, you might not think of colonization in America because, you know, you're used to thinking of a lot of times, you know, kind of a population that was there first and then in come the intruders rather than someone who was abducted somewhere else and brought in here and they're a minority group from day one, from the day they're dragged in. You know, it can seem different. And there are differences that come out of those differences in origins, but there's still a whole lot of similarities. And that's the kind of thing that Frantz Fanon drove home. And another book, Racial Oppression in America by Blauner, uses a colonial model to think about racism in America, right? There was quite a bit of work on that, in that vein, going on back in the 70s. Yeah, oh, absolutely. It's really important to look at those parallels. And now, the one thing I'll say to you is I hear you, you know, you can have different political projects with different groups. You know, Black folk have a particular political project going on here in America. And it's around our Blackness, because our Blackness was used to define our slave, you know, to enslave us. It was the defining criterion for our enslavement, right? And now we both recognize its contingency, you know, so you can have a sense of irony. You know, I have an article, Irony, Solidarity, and Contingency. You know, you can recognize the contingency of your social identity on the one hand, and still forcefully use your social identity as a political rallying point to unify with others and do political stuff, you know, make political action happen, right? And, you know, that is what I think, you know, and that basis for your group, you know, unity can be, for us, it's race. It can be something else for another group. You know, that's part of your self-definition of, you know, we're going to define ourselves in our own way, according to our own terms, not just be defined by others. You know, that's what Black people started to do. We used to be defined by others before the end of the Civil War. Then we started defining ourselves. And we included people who look like me with people who look like my wife, who's much darker, and people who look like, you know, people who could pass. On the other end, right, all the way up and down, across. But that's been a constant and conscious political project. We know we write books about it, we do plays about it. It's part of our art. It's part of our, you know, our novels. You know, a group's identity isn't given, right? I could be, what's my identity? Am I Black? Am I mainly a Black person? Am I mainly a guy? Am I mainly somebody who has a college degree? Am I mainly a professor? Am I mainly somebody who might be, have a certain religion? Am I mainly, you know, Muslim? Am I mainly Christian? You know, what I can go through about literally 120 things you could say I'm mainly. And I'm picking from that menu a few things that I'm zeroing in on. Right? But what's making me zero in on those particular things? Well, I'm drawing on literature. Like I said, the Harlem Renaissance is defining Blackness. Then the 60s is defining Blackness. There's Malcolm, there's Martin, there's Toni Morrison. Here, you know, here comes Spike Lee. Here comes music, here comes the musician. You know, there's a whole constant process of defining who we are. And it's sometimes a debate. Sometimes you know, it's a unified movement, you know, in a certain direction. So yeah, I think that dynamism is what makes this whole process, you know, really exciting. Sometimes frustrating, but really exciting.
All right. Thanks to both of you for a really interesting conversation and to highlight some, you know, really, I think, really critical issues about conceptions of race, the consequences of those concepts, and sort of, you know, not to say that there's a resolution, but to recognize something for what it is, right? So, you know, because one way of dealing with issues is to actually give it a name, give them a name. And once you've given them a name, then you can start the process of trying to approach the topic. You know, one of the thematic elements here, so I'm going to start drawing on the questions from the audience, is about the question then about, you know, the level of agency against the structure of racism. So if, you know, if we're saying that there's a systemic issue of racism that is being imposed on us, you know, by a system, even as we then try to resist by using that same system, you know, what is it that's constructive, right? Not just for the people who are in the group, but then also for allies. So there's a series of questions here that all tie this together, I think. So let me just put them together, and then that'll give, I think, something to sort of respond to. So one is, you know, how do you empathize, or how do we empathize with others who are not like us, right? And then a related question to that is a question that, you know, if we're trying to empathize with other people who are not like us, then how do we get past the stereotypes to deal with the prejudices, right? Because, you know, we need to empathize to overcome the prejudices, but we're being blocked by the stereotypes. So how do we get past all of those? And then as a result of that, then what is the process of reconciliation? You know, here in Australia, and then most critically for lawyers, people who are in the legal system, you know, what is our duties or what are our responsibilities for all of that? So with time, so I think that assembles a lot of the questions together here. So Jody, is it all right if we start with you? And then Mary, if you want to add in, you can add in.
Sure. First, intention, attention, and effort. That's what it's going to take for us to start to extend to marginalized groups and out-group members empathy and sympathy. Because like I said, at the level of our mirror neurons, at the neural level, we have biases against our group members. There's a kind of racial indifference. We have not only a lot of unconscious stereotypes, but also unconscious feelings, unconscious attitudes toward our group members. So that means that it's going to take, we're going to have to try to break the mental habit about negative habit about our group members by, when we're in the presence, not doing what a lot of people think we should do and have said we should do historically, which is practice color blindness. What you've heard historically was the way to get over color is to be colorblind, right? But what all of these studies show that I go on to in my first book, Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, is that if a stereotype is a mental habit, right? That's what a habit is automatic, well-learned set of associations that can run automatically without our conscious awareness. So for example, if you have a habit of biting your nails when you're watching television, you're liable to fall into that habit whenever you're sitting in front of a TV, unless you remind yourself whenever you're in the presence of environmental cues that trigger your habit, like the television, you remind yourself of, hey, I'm supposed to be trying to break this habit. You call to mind your conscious responses for how you want to start responding to the world, and you inhibit your automatic responses, right? Well, if a stereotype is, which it is, a well-learned set of associations that can run automatically without our conscious awareness, like a mental habit, essentially a mental habit, then the worst way to try to overcome a mental habit is to ignore it when you're in the presence of cues that trigger it. Right? You have to, when you're in the presence of cues that trigger your habit, you have to be color conscious, call to mind your personal standards for how you want to respond to the world, inhibit negative ones, and make it intentional, bring intentionality to your social interactions. You know, color blindness, down that road, failure lies, because that just gives free rein to unconscious bias. Unconscious mental reflexes. They can run rampant, right? So that sounds counterintuitive at first. That's why I had to write my first book to support it, right? But now, a lot of people say, oh, they kind of come around, and I have some other, concerns, but but that's the basic. And then finally, you said what to do about it. I'm going to first. I'm going to throw the ball to Mary and follow up what she thinks about what we can do about it.
Yeah, thanks. I'll fix it. So I actually have to say I laughed when I saw the byline for this thing, like, what is it? Da da da. How do we fix it? Sure, no worries. Got 90 minutes. We'll do that. So yeah, actually, so. I guess the thing is we didn't really spend, and this is my fault because I got us onto race and racialization pretty deep, but and we all kind of dived there deep rather than going into some of the stuff you talk about in your book, which is around really trying to sort of, in a sense, you're taking state law seriously, state criminal law seriously, and you literally, if a lawyer, somebody who's obsessed with criminal law, who loves all that stuff around defenses and the mechanics and the widgets of it all. It is one of those, you can find the bias in there all the time, and in fact that's what I do in my research. I'm finishing a doctoral thesis at the moment, which is around the way that culture influences. I have a particular way of thinking about culture. Culture influences sentencing processes in Central Australian courts, and how that reveals a lot of things that are structural right throughout the whole criminal justice system and the Anglophone criminal justice system. So. And so the thing is, it can be one of the things that you can observe, like you can really sort of sit there in court and go, that magistrate they're racist or something. Or you can say that lawyer, they are stereotyping that person in a particular way. But the thing is that what's really obvious after a while is that there's all of these things that are systematized, that are operating, and you talk about this in the book as well. We are influenced by our social structures, and you talk about it in a particular way, like in terms of how is it that so many not Aboriginal people, but African Americans end up being, I mean, you go right there and you say, look, these people are actually doing things that are convicted and sentenced. They're not happy things. Thanks. Yep, got that 10 minutes. They're not happy things that people are doing. There's violence. And we're normally doing it in our country. We're doing it against our own people overwhelmingly. Right? It's really serious stuff. This is not something to pretend, oh, yeah, no, they just stole a Mars bar and did a driving offence. That's not what's going on, right? So although in Central Australia, driving offences are ludicrously high, like it's kind of crazy, but it's part of this kind of convenient persecution. So the thing is, you've got these systemic effects which make people fatalistic because they observe it, this kind of complacency around the casual racism and the way. So, for example, I saw a really dear friend of mine who's an excellent lawyer. In fact, I mentored her in her first year out when she came to Central Australia. And I was just, arrived in Alice, went into the Supreme Court, sat down, waited for her while she's finishing this case. It was a case where I know from hearing about the case from her, the fellow should have gone to trial and should have been acquitted. He'd been bail refused. He'd spent 9 months in prison. The prosecutor, who suddenly had it that day or just previously, just realised what a dud case it was and how this guy should never have even been charged, took a lazy route out. This is where the individual discretion plays a part in a system, and the system it's an accretion of these, the systems are human, right? So they're an accretion of all of these little decisions that are made. He made a decision to give an easy, low-level charge and said, look, if you plead to this, it'll be over and done with today. And so instead of actually having the balls to actually withdraw the charge, which is what he should have done, which would have been a bit of work, would have been writing a report to the DPP, all this sort of stuff. And my friend has to take it to her client because of the ethical rules, structure, again, right? The guy who's Aboriginal is really indifferent to the system and is like, whatever, your system is just so screwed. Like, desert people have got such incredible insights into the way it works because everybody has got something to do with it all the time, whether it's you or someone close to you. We know, and it's just they don't follow the rule of law at all. There's different rules that apply to black people. If you can go heavy, it always goes heavy. That sort of thing. Anyway, he just said, "Yep, just get me out of here." And he agreed because he knew that he wouldn't have to wait another few more days of a letter being sent to the DPP, all that kind of stuff, so he could get out. And so what does the judge do? This is a sentence for, if it had gone cold, straight to a magistrate's court, which is where it would have gone, the charge, he would have got a bond and a conviction, and that's it. Which is the lowest level kind of thing without getting no conviction that you can get in this jurisdiction. But instead, he backdated the sentence and gave him a sentence of imprisonment for 9 months. So now you've got this document that's sitting there, and all that judges read in future is that this guy's got a 9-month sentence, and they think it's really serious. So the next time he goes before the court, because he very likely will, because the greatest predictor of being caught up in the criminal justice system is you'll get caught up in it again, is that you'll have some other judge that looks at that, treats it as a stable piece of evidence, and says, well, he must have done something worse. So because we're so logical, we're going to hit him even harder this time, and maybe this time he'll stop and he'll get an even higher penalty next time. So in terms of what you can do, I mean, the thing that I say, this is basic standpoint theory, right, which comes from feminism, which critical Indigenous scholars, a whole bunch of other, outsider, insider groups of actually adopting and use as a way of critiquing it. You look at how the evidence is framed, what's included and what's not, and you challenge that. What else should be inside the frame? And then once you've got it in there, you think about how you look at it. What perspective are you coming at it from? Yep, thanks, John. So you look at it from those perspectives, but then as lawyers, I think we're at a time where we really need to try to, this is the last chance for state law. I've yet to see state law practiced properly with respect to First Peoples. In all of my years as a practitioner, as an appellate lawyer, as a teacher, as a researcher, you sit there and you routinely see sloppy premises for decisions. The factual basis is not there. The evidence isn't good enough to draw the fact that is inferred. that then is the basis for applying certain principles, right? So there's a problem about evidence, facts, inferences that are drawn. Now, this is just basic stuff from law school. But why isn't it applied to Aboriginal people? This is where that stuff that Jody was just talking about comes in. You have got to guard against that, and you've got to be prepared to stand there and stand sometimes in front of a furnace, because you are going right against a culture which exists within our system, which actually tolerates racism, and it cloaks us in this neutrality, and it cloaks us in this notion that the courts are aracial. Right? I mean, when we talk about things like, you know, you're talking about like the negative stereotyping around, you know, first of all, you know, black people are all just, or Aboriginal people are just, you know, they're weak, they're mentally weak, they're psychologically weak, all that sort of stuff. That it's now generally recognised, like well-educated people in the courts now know that colonisation has this impact now. But it literally has no effect. They go, oh yeah, that has an effect, but what do? We've got this individual who's dysfunctional, so therefore we've got to lock him up because he's dangerous. And it's like, no, actually, that's not a natural corollary. We can do better. So it actually requires a lot of bravery and going right against the grain of all that enculturation you get when you're at law school, and then which you further get which you're in training when you actually come into legal practice. That's it.
All right. Oh, that was a really good insight, Mary. Jody, with the time remaining, I'm going to let you have the closing. You've got about 3 minutes left or 2 minutes left. Oh, sorry, your microphone. You got to turn your microphone on.
Great, thanks. So just kind of the one thing we didn't get into that ties into what Mary just said, so I'll pull it in, is how to think about wrongdoers, how to think about Black folk, whatever continent they're on, who are socially marginalized, how to think about them, us, when crimes are committed, when serious crimes are committed, when crimes of violence are committed. You know, how do we morally judge them? Are our moral judgments themselves racially biased, or in your case, we'll say, I would say racially biased here, you know, whatever the other kind of criteria you see people using to discriminate, are they using that particular basis to otherize, demonize, monsterize, what I call inward-eyes the wrongdoer? Because that's what we tend to do in our criminal justice system. That's the purpose that the criminal justice system serves, at least in America. It is supposed to be the institution we make moral judgments through. And according to the mens rea requirement, you only punish people if they are subjectively culpable, if they are morally condemnable. That's what it's supposed to mean. And so it invites us right off the bat to either to look at people who some can say now are people who deserve to be otherized, demonized, monsterized, punished, made to suffer for the harm they've inflicted on others. And it's one of the hardest challenges that many of us have, to look at a violent wrongdoer with compassion and to make allowances for that violent wrongdoer's human frailty, and to view all of us as tissues of contingency. You know, the self that is the object of moral evaluation is nothing but a tissue of contingencies. You know, and I don't have time to go into that right now, but that's one of the things I try to go into a lot, you know, moral luck, and the fact that even morally, we are at the mercy of luck. That sounds counterintuitive. Moral luck sounds like an oxymoron. How can I flip a coin? Heads, I'm good. Tails, I'm bad. Heads, you're wicked. Tails, you're worthy. How can that be? That sounds like it's an irrational basis to make moral judgment. We do it all the time. It's all over the criminal justice system. And it's all over our conventional moral reasoning. And once you see that, you see that there's no really morally credible, legitimate basis to make a lot of our moral judgments. You start to accept epistemic humility about our capacity to make those judgments and therefore act accordingly, temper the hard edge of retribution with compassion for the human frailty of wrongdoers. So I'll just leave it kind of with that. I wish we had more time to dive into that sort of stuff.
Well, thanks for that. Thanks to Jody and thanks for Mary on the contrasting and also complementary viewpoints, which I think is very enlightening. It's good for providing a starting point, I think. Right. So I think, there's a lot of people in the audience, particularly with the students, who are just starting to kind of, learn about these kinds of issues. And it's incredibly complicated. They're being thrown into deep water. But I think having a conversation like this with, this academic connection helps them give some kind of a compass so that once they step away from the shore, start getting into the deeper waters, they at least understand the kinds of tides and the currents that are at play and what it is that they're working against, right? And so I think that's really, a crucial step. So thank you both very much for that. And I do very much want to stress this notion of epistemic humility, that it's this thing that I think most academics are always trying to stress to students, is that we don't know everything. And as human beings, we can't ever fully know everything about everything, or even know everything about a particular topic. And we're limited by our senses and our state of knowledge, our backgrounds. And as a result of that, it does require a certain level of a check, a constant self-check about what it is that we're thinking and why we're thinking it. And the thing is that we need to promote that kind of epistemic humility across a much broader, not just the legal profession, but I think society as a whole. So thank you both for that conversation. I think this is very good. I'm going to give Isabella the last note. So apologies to Tom for this on the recording. But Isabella, I think you just want to mention some of the next sessions in the series. My last note is that I almost forgot that this was being co-sponsored as well by the Law Reform and Social Justice program at the College of Law, in addition to BPOC. So I'll make note of that here. So Isabella, go ahead and let everyone know what's coming up next. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone, for coming. And obviously, COVID has disrupted some things, but there will still continue to be events held online. In the pipeline, we have another law event with Jonathan. We also have a event relating to education coming up and health. So just like our Facebook page to keep updated. And thanks again, everyone, for coming. I hope everyone learned something and is staying safe. I know that some news came out during this talk, which might have been distracting everyone. But yeah, stay safe. And thanks again, Jonathan and Mary. We really appreciate it. That was really awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nuala Dricker.